Yesterday, a House Oversight Subcommittee held a hearing called Climate Change, the Impact on Public Health, where I was honored to be a witness, along with 4 doctors chosen by the majority. It was probably the least scientific, least logical 2 hours of my life. And remember, I've been to a lot of faculty meetings in my time. At the hearing, nobody ever defined the mysterious, all-encompassing, intellectually sloppy term climate change, whose impact we'd been asked to assess. Now, I think that's supposed to mean the 1-degree rise in global average temperature since 1900. At least half of which the United Nations agrees is from natural variation and not due to industrial emissions of carbon dioxide. But I couldn't be sure because when one of the members of the subcommittee asked me, yes or no, is climate change real? And I asked him to define climate change so I could answer the question. He stopped and went on to the doctors. Here's a list of just some of the things the doctors and members of the majority claimed were caused by climate change, whatever that is. This is not a joke, this is real. Obesity, mental illness, violence against women, autism, asthma, Lyme disease, Zika, hurricanes, and an increase in temperature-related deaths. This was congressional testimony. Now, in case you didn't guess, there are none, zilch data that shows that these things are caused by emissions of carbon dioxide, even if it were responsible for the full 1-degree rise since 1900. But that didn't slow anybody down yesterday, and that brings us to today's briefing on the actual effects of those emissions, and I think this will be among the most scientific and logical hours of our lives because of who we've brought to talk with you. Dr. Craig Idso, a member of our CO2 coalition, is the principal researcher for this new white paper that collects the findings from hundreds of studies on carbon dioxide and food security. Craig is one of the world's leading scientists in this field. He's an agronomist and climatologist and the chairman of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. He's come all the way from Arizona to speak with us today. As you'll soon discover, we are in for an intellectual treat this morning. I've asked Craig to provide a summary of his findings and leave lots of times for your questions and discussions because he has such a deep knowledge just not of CO2 in plants, but probably of any question that interests you about the interaction of the energy we need and the environment that we cherish, also known as the debate over climate change. Craig, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caleb. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I would like to thank the CO2 Coalition for the efforts that they put forth in producing this white paper, and appreciate them also extending the invitation for me to come and to share some of its key findings with you here today. And that's really what I plan to do for the next 25 minutes or so, is take you through several slides to illustrate what's in the paper. And the paper really begins with the premise of looking at global food security. How there's been a number of researchers over the last few years that have looked at this issue and they study it in great detail. And what they find, and they all come out and suggest that in the next few decades, global food supply is going to fall far short of global food demand. And so they have come up with several different plans or solutions to be able to bridge that gap. And pretty much it begins like this, how we all know that global population has been increasing. By mid-century, it's expected that the population of the planet will be about 9.8 billion people, rising to 11.2 billion by the end of this century. Now, even though this does not represent a doubling of population, these scientists suggest that it's going to require a doubling or near doubling of food supply in order to stave off crippling food shortages that could cause malnutrition and starvation of millions of people worldwide. And the reason for the need to have that doubling is mainly based upon shifting habits, dietary habits, where people consume more meat. Well, that's quite an incredible task if that's correct, and I think that those estimations are fairly good. So how is this going to be accomplished? How can we actually double food production by the end of this century? Well, one of the solutions that's often suggested is to increase the area of land farmed, right? That seems pretty simple. If we increase the area of land farmed, we're going to have a lot more food to feed the people. But that is not necessarily the best solution. A lot of people are concerned that as we do that, we're going to take land away from wild nature, right? There's plant and animal species that inhabit that land, and nobody wants to see them go extinct. And so that's become kind of a knotty issue in and of itself. So a second alternative solution is to increase the crop yield per unit of land, right? Take the existing farmland that we have right now and simply raise the yields on that land. However, in many parts of the world, the historical rate of increase in crop yield has been declining as the genetic ceiling for maximal yield potential has been approached. And there's also concerns that technological advancements and intelligence advancements won't be able to bridge that gap either. So a third possible solution then that's been set forth in the literature is to increase crop yields per unit of nutrients applied. However, nutrients are not always limiting or a limiting factor, and their application, of course, is going to increase production costs. In addition, the over-application of nutrients can have an adverse impact on the environment via eutrophication. As a lot of those nutrients, the excess nutrients, will run off down into water bodies, and you can have these algae that will then form these blooms and take oxygen out of the water column, and therefore cause these rapid die-offs of various marine life and aquatic life. And then the fourth solution they often propose is to increase crop yields per unit of water used. But here again, it's problematic. Water is regionally scarce as a resource, and projected demands are unlikely to be met by increases in irrigation in the future. So you can understand when you look at each of these four potential solutions, there's a lot of pessimism about being able to actually meet those food needs that we're going to have just a few short decades from now on to the end of the century. But yet, despite this pessimism, there is an alternative solution for ensuring food security. And as this is what we detail in this white paper, that solution is thankfully already being applied, courtesy of 4 key yield-enhancing physiological responses of plants to rising concentrations of atmospheric CO2. So how does this work? Well, looking at this first response, rising atmospheric CO2 increases plant productivity. This is simply because carbon dioxide is the basic food source for plants. It's the primary raw material they utilize during the process of photosynthesis to construct their tissues. And at current CO2 concentrations, that plant growth is limited by CO2. Therefore, the more CO2 there is in the air for plants to eat or take in via photosynthesis, the bigger and better the plants grow. Consequently, higher CO2 levels produce higher crop yields, which fact has been conclusively demonstrated in literally thousands of laboratory and field experiments conducted over the past several decades. On my website, I have a section called our Plant Growth Database, where I have archived the results of literally over 10,000 experimental conditions where plants have been grown under higher CO2 levels, demonstrating these beneficial productivity increases that occur. And you can go and look at pretty much any plant that you're interested in and find out how CO2 will increase the photosynthesis or the biomass of that plant in the future. This graphic here kind of illustrates the main findings that come out of those studies. And generally what we see is that for a 300 part per million rise in CO2, and that's about the amount of increase we're going to see during this century, the 300 part per million rise in CO2 raises the productivity of most crops by about 1/3, which includes increases in the number of branches and tillers, more and thicker leaves, more extensive root systems, more flowers and fruit, and of course, more crop yields or higher crop yields. And this is a great example of a recent study done on pigeon pea plants. And you can see that this plant here was grown under current CO2 concentrations of, well, actually a few years ago, of 390 parts per million, and then at 550 parts per million. And you can see clearly the plant that was grown at elevated CO2 has greater above ground and below ground biomass. Looking here at the root system, more roots, the larger nodules in the roots as well. The stem, much thicker. Of course, the leaves and the leaf area and the whole plant. And it also produced more pods and more peas as well. Well, kind of an amalgamation of a lot of these studies several years ago, I looked at, well, what is the average growth response under various conditions for various crops for a 300 part per million increase? And this is what I found, and it stands pretty appropriate today. These numbers are pretty much remain. So you can see that as the CO2 concentration increases, we expect that just because the rise in CO2 and nothing else, to experience productivity increases in terms of biomass, the amount of about 15% for cam crops, 49% for C3 cereals, 20% for C4 cereals, 24% for fruits and melons, 44% for legumes, 48% for roots and tubers, and 37% for vegetables. Quite an incredible response. The good news is that these responses may very well be conservative when it comes to enhancing global food supply. And that is illustrated, or that fact is illustrated in this next slide, where I'm showing you the soybean seed yield response of 8 different genotypes, okay, to ambient and elevated CO2 concentrations. And what you see here, obviously, the major difference is that you have about a 50% difference in yield at the low yielding cultivar versus the highest yielding cultivar. And so the point is, if we can identify the genotypes that are highly responsive to CO2 enrichment and then incorporate them into breeding programs designed to produce the highest possible yields under rising atmospheric CO2, we can see much greater increases in yields in the future. And how much greater? Well, there was another recent study that was conducted on rice, 16 different rice genotypes. And the responses that they found for a doubling of CO2 range from anywhere from about near zero to a whopping 263% increase. So again, when you get increases like that, it's quite possible that this one key physiological response is going to be sufficient to meet food demands in the near future. All right, well, the second way that CO2 can help increase crop yields is by increasing these yields per unit of nutrients applied. Now, many agricultural lands today are nutrient poor. They lack nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other macro and micronutrients, which limit the plant growth. What we find that here, the research shows that elevated CO2 mitigates such deficiencies by enhancing plant nutrient acquisition and nutrient use efficiency. Now, in terms of nutrient acquisition, we find that elevated CO2 typically stimulates the development of larger and more extensive root systems, which then extract greater amounts of mineral nutrients from the soils. And then with respect to nitrogen use efficiency, we find here that plants generally need or utilize less nutrients per unit of biomass produced under elevated CO2. Hence, their nitrogen or their nutrient use efficiency increases. Another interesting benefit is that under CO2, plants often mobilize nutrients out of their leaves or roots and into other plant areas in order to increase their availability for enhancing sink development in the actual fruit or grain, or stimulating other processes that were nutrient limited under elevated CO2. A nice example of this nutrient acquisition benefit from CO2 is looking at nutrient uptake of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium over 2 different growing seasons for soybean. And the authors of this study found that a small 135 part per million rise in CO2 increased soybean seed nitrogen by 21 to 25%, phosphorus by 29 to 31%, and potassium by 23 to 27%. The third key benefit, yes?
Back on that slide, yes, genotypes that are reactive and more efficient to?
I would have to go back and look. There's usually, most of the studies, there's probably maybe a handful or more genotypes that are studied most widely. And so really, we don't know the full response based on all the different genotypes that are possible. So there's not as many are studied. So good question. I don't know if this is a more responsive or less responsive one.
Okay.
Because, and you're going to see a wide difference depending upon it.
Normal, current.
Yeah, this is a typical response, correct. CO2 increases the crop yields per unit of water used as well, and this is a wonderful benefit that can help us enhance crop yields in the future. Now, agriculture-related water use accounts for some 80 to 90% of all fresh water used by humans. Yet projected improvements in water management and efficiencies will still leave this enormous gap in agriculture-related water needs as the population increases in the future. But here, rising atmospheric CO2 will reduce, if not eliminate, that gap by increasing this plant water use efficiency. So what is water use efficiency? Well, as it's generally defined, water use efficiency is the amount of biomass produced by a plant per unit of water lost. So what you have is in this diagram here, oops, let me back up. This diagram right here shows you an example of a leaf stomatal pore at higher CO2 and lower CO2. And you can see at high CO2, plants tend to open or do not open their stomatal pores as wide as they do at lower CO2 concentrations. And sometimes they actually also have fewer stomata per unit area on the plant at higher CO2. Well, the end result of this process is that less water escapes back to the atmosphere via transpiration. And so these plants become more water use efficient. In fact, sometimes increasing their water use efficiency as much as 7,100% for a doubling of atmospheric CO2. Here's a recent study. We can focus pretty much on the blue values here, looking at the response of let's see, what plant is this again? A pepper plant grown under different levels of CO2, 400, 550, 700, 900 parts per million. And we find here that water use efficiency increased by 59%, 133, and 244% in response to a 38, 75, and 125% increase in CO2. Well, what does all this mean and suggest? Well, in the future, because of the CO2-induced increases in plant water use efficiency, farmers will be able to produce about the same amount of crop yield that they do today, but while using less water. That's going to save them a lot of money and some irrigation. Crops will also become more resistant to water stress and drought. They'll be able to grow and reproduce on farmland that was previously too dry for them to exist. And there will be less crop failure and losses due to water-related stresses, of course, equaling higher yields than we see presently. A good example of this last fact, becoming less susceptible to these stresses. This next slide here shows you the photosynthesis and total biomass response of sweet potatoes grown under combinations of CO2 and water-filled capacity. So what you see here, the trend is basically the same in either of these panels, but under ambient CO2 and adequate water supply, you're going to get a nice biomass response. But if you induce stress, water stress, that response is going to decline. If you if you don't have water stress but add CO2, here we see a nice 58% increase in biomass. But then if we take this particular situation of water stress and add CO2 to it, we see a nice 48% increase right here. And it pretty much fully mitigated that water stress, as the values that we see here are nearly identical to what they are under normal CO2 and inadequate water conditions. Well, the last key benefit that we're going to see from elevated CO2 can be summed up by it's going to help ameliorate other environmental stresses that occur naturally in nature. Higher levels of CO2 have been shown to help plants better withstand and endure stresses and limitations, including excessive heat, ozone pollution, light stress, soil toxicity, herbivory, disease, salinity stress, and the list goes on and on. And what is more, the percentage growth enhancement produced by an increase in the air's CO2 content is generally greater under these stressful and resource-limited conditions than it is when growing conditions are ideal. So just to share a few brief examples of this is looking at temperature stress. What we see here is the total biomass and grain yield of wheat and rice crops averaged over 2 growing seasons, or actually 1, 2, 3, 4 growing seasons under 2 different CO2 concentrations and temperature treatments. And I'm going to focus right here as we take you through this particular slide, but as you can see, at ambient temperatures, elevated CO2 concentrations, again, and this is a very small increase in CO2, 100 part per million, or 25%, resulting in a 13.5% increase in grain yield. If we have our control conditions and add temperature stress, yes, you can see a decline in yields, but then we add CO2 to that, and again, you get a 31% increase, and it's about the same and fully mitigating the temperature stress in that instance. Ozone stress, very similar situation here. We are looking at wheat this time. Here's control conditions, the biomass, dry weight that's produced. And if we add CO2, we get a nice 36% increase in dry weight. We add ozone, pollution ozone, we get a 34% decrease. If we add CO2 to this treatment, it fully ameliorates and mitigates that effect and takes it almost back to the identical value without ozone. So a phenomenal response there. Pathogen attack, same type of thing. Leaf and stem dry weight of 5-week-old non-infected and barley yellow dwarf virus-infected wheat plants grown under ambient or elevated CO2. And again, you can see elevated CO2 ameliorates that negative effect from the barley yellow dwarf virus. Also, herbivore attack. This particular study looked at wheat plants and aphid fertility and found that under elevated CO2 conditions, fertility was decreased for these aphids. Of course, and that's going to bode much better for the yields of the wheat plants. And then finally, just one final example of this, we're going to look at salinity stress. And here you can see, if I can get there we go. Salinity stress, where here you have normal conditions, no salinity, add salinity stress. And here you have those same conditions, but adding carbon dioxide. And so you can see the relative increase for each of these situations, 42, 56%, 62, 61%. And this is kind of a neat additional finding of this study, the antioxidant capacity. They looked at the total antioxidant capacity of these 2 plants under these conditions, and elevated CO2 increased them significantly, 142 and 61%, 293 and 109%. So not only did elevated CO2 increase the quantity or the yield of these plants, it enhanced their quality as well. Well, when you consider all of these great benefits of CO2 that they have for agriculture, I love this quote here because it sums them up. This is a quote by Dr. Sylvan H. Whitwer, who is the father of modern research in this area. And as you can see, it was way back in 1982. These things were known way back then. And he says, the rising level of atmospheric CO2 could be the one global natural resource that is progressively increasing food production and total biological output in a world of otherwise diminishing natural resources of land, water, energy, minerals, and fertilizer. It is a means of inadvertently increasing the productivity of farming systems and other photosynthetically active ecosystems. The effects know no boundaries, and both developing and developed countries are and will be sharing equally. So in conclusion, to answer that question, how are we going to achieve global food supply or global food security in the future? Well, governments need to support policies that are going to increase the crop yields per unit of land area, per unit of nutrients supplied, and per unit of water used. Fortunately, elevated CO2 promotes such food security by increasing crop land use efficiency, crop nutrient use efficiency, and crop water use efficiency, as well as alleviating several other environmental and resource stresses and limitations. Well, these CO2-induced benefits to agriculture will continue to accrue in the future as long as the air's CO2 concentration is allowed to continue to rise. Any efforts to restrict CO2 emissions will have consequences, including reduced crop yields, higher food prices, and growing food insecurity that will disproportionately burden the poor. Policy leaders should therefore wise up to these facts if they want to avoid the undernourishment and potential starvation of hundreds of millions of persons just a few short decades from now. So that's pretty much the gist of the white paper. This time I'd be happy to address and answer a few questions.
You didn't talk about, although it was indicated here in a few of the examples, concentrations up to 600 or 700 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
How's that going to be created? These have evidently been created experimentally.
Mm-hmm.
Are you forecasting that that might be created naturally or by anticipated increases of CO2? Or
Yeah.
if not, how should it be done?
So, of course, naturally, we are increasing the concentration of atmospheric CO2 by burning fossil fuels. That's in, of course, cement production, and there's other things and that affect that, but the number one influence is the increase in fossil fuel combustion. And so the CO2 concentration has already risen some 45% above pre-industrial values before the Industrial Revolution. So it has already increased for these experiments. Yes, you have to increase them under certain conditions. It's done in controlled environment chambers and also outside in the open air through what's called free air CO2 enrichment systems. Well, they will put up this nice piping setup where they can release pure CO2 all across an area, and based upon the wind speed, there's computer programs that will determine and is able to elevate that area by as much as 600, 800, 900 parts per million or more. You can really elevate it about as much as you want. Now, in terms of what's the highest level of CO2 that we're going to get, nobody knows. There's all sorts of projections. But I think most of the projections suggest that we more than likely will not reach above 1 to 2,000 parts per million in the very, very extreme case. So more than likely, most projections indicate we will be about 550 parts per million, 600, maybe by the end of this century.
Can you point to events that are already occurring?
What
Plant
kind of
growth
events?
increases that are already occurring
Absolutely we can.
naturally.
Absolutely. Let me get a couple of slides up and I'll pull and show you some. So how do we know that this is already occurring, that CO2 is benefiting? That's a great question, and we do know. One way that you can tell this is by looking at tree rings. So scientists will core the trees and they'll utilize a measure of water use efficiency, intrinsic water use efficiency, and they can calculate how water use efficiency has changed over the past century or however long the tree ring goes. And what you find here is that you see these large increases that have occurred as the CO2 concentration has risen over the past several decades. And there's several locations, and you find this literally on our website. I've got citations from trees on pretty much every continent where they grow. But you see things like this, that over the last part of this last century is when they've really taken off and experienced an increase as the CO2 concentration has really begun to rise. Here's a couple of another nice ones, 28% increase, 32% increase in response to about 35, 40% increase in CO2. Now let me get one or two more other slides. Further proof of these benefits of CO2 are also noted in satellite imagery. And so you have observations from all across the globe that indicate the world has been greening. The whole of the terrestrial biosphere has been rising from these incredible benefits of CO2 that have occurred. And here's one example of a study looking at Earth's land surface area, how they have become a net sink of CO2 since about 1940. So it was releasing CO2 to the air. Now it's sucking more CO2 into the atmosphere. Another example, this takes into account both land and ocean carbon uptake, how it's doubled, gone from about a little over 2 petagrams of carbon per year to about 5 petagrams of carbon per year in 2010. Now, let me go to this next slide. This is another slide conducted a few years ago in 2016 looking at satellite imagery. So since 1979, satellites have been measuring reflectivity and vegetation, getting various indices there from up above the Earth. And it's a great measure for how vegetation has changed over this period of time. And so studies we now have enough data that studies have been published in the literature determining what's really happening with global vegetation. And what you see is a situation like this, just as we suspect that the rise in CO2 is causing the great, we call it greening of the planet, how vegetation is becoming more robust with time, and certainly because of CO2. So here they determined about 75% of the land area had experienced positive changes in leaf area index over this time period. Another study that was conducted in 2017 found that net primary productivity across the globe increased by 21.5% over this period, and these authors also ascribed that increase to the rise in CO2. Another independent research team calculated that gross primary productivity increased by 24.9 petagrams of carbon over this period. And they determined via relationships here that a 10% increase in atmospheric CO2 raised global gross primary productivity by 8%. And the most recent one here from 2018, this particular set of researchers found that 75% of the land area experienced positive increases in gross primary production, and CO2 accounted for 66% of those trends. So the data is clear. And the neat thing about these results I just showed you is this. You're often told, and it's often mentioned that, we've had 2 of the warmest or 3 of the warmest decades of the last century have been the last little bit, right? We've had massive deforestation, massive unprecedented forest fires, droughts, everything else. Yet despite every one of those presumed negative influences on climate, we see this. And that's because the benefits of carbon dioxide have been able to overpower all of those negative effects except in a few locales. And so it's a phenomenal benefit from CO2. Yes?
Myron E. Bell, CEI. Craig, that was great, and your website is an invaluable resource for everybody in the field, and I would encourage everyone here to look at it. You not only have reviewed thousands of studies, agronomical studies, but the entire range of climate studies. But my question is, it really is astonishing to look at the amount of research that's been done in this area, the thousands of papers that have been done starting, in the 1940s or 50s, and yet very little of it seems to make its way into the climate debate or into the IPCC reports. Can you discuss that and maybe offer some thoughts on why that's so?
It's hard to know. It's hard. You'd have to ask them to get their reason why, but it's unfortunate that it's not included as much because it does change the outlook. It changes the picture of a lot of things. And frankly, we should be much more confident in these projected effects of CO2 on the biosphere than the climate projected effects. Why? Because it's a lot easier to do an experiment where all you change is the CO2 concentration on a plant, and we've done that. We can do that in the field, whereas the temperature-related projections are mostly based on the climate models, and so there's a lot more variables that go into the transfer of energy between the Earth atmosphere and ocean system and how that might change with CO2. So a lot fewer variables going into this. We should have a much higher confidence that this is going to happen in the future.
Hi, Mike McCracken from the Climate Institute. So I'm a climate scientist. So back in the 1980s, I actually was involved in the program with Sylvan Whitwer. And the DOE state-of-the-art assessments, which preceded the IPCC, had a separate volume on direct effects of CO2 on climate. I mean, it as you say, has been long recognized. So I'm actually not at all sure why, whether what advances have actually occurred since then that are actually significant. And they've actually been considered, I think. I mean, I think virtually all the agricultural models consider the CO2 concentration. The issue is the other influences of what happens with CO2, and that all these studies are done under really quite controlled conditions, whereas the climate's going to be changing. And we know that the weather, climate is the average of the weather, and the weather is what affects things. We know that changes in weather during a season affect crop yield. You get a really hot time in the Ukraine, and they don't produce crops and stuff like that. So, if you increase CO2, it goes in the ocean, and you have increased acidification, which is going to cause all kinds of problems with skeletons and species and other things. So it's a relative weighing of all these different effects that needs to be done, and I mean, okay, this is sort of a positive influence, but there are lots of negative influences, and the question is how to weigh them all together. What I wanted to ask though was, most of your focus, I think, is on grains and grain crops and how to produce those. I mean, I think what's going to happen to leafy vegetables is it's going to change. People are going to grow them in warehouses under LED lights with nutrition and stuff. But the hard issue is really grains, and a lot of those go to production of meat. And then the question becomes, is that going to continue? How do you make a projection out to 2100 on that, and what the nutritious value is? And I think actually what most of the community of the science community is worried about as an impact is something like 90% of the grains in international trade come from 6 or 7 countries where most of the production is. And we know from experience that if you have a failure in one of those areas, the Ukraine or take the Russian harvest and everything, you get a collapse. And now with these increasing vulnerability and extremes, if it happens in 2 regions, you really get in trouble. I have some business guys I know who follow the Food and Agricultural Organization crop index, and if the price goes over a certain amount, you get the Arab Spring, or you get Syrian Revolution, or you get all kinds of things, because people need food, and they're going to take their money out of the market and go to food. So I guess the issue is what's going to help sustain grain production. How do you make the whole system more resilient as the population goes up? And there's 100 or 120 countries that are importing all this grain and depend on it absolutely. They don't produce the grains they need. I mean, grain production is huge, and it'd be great if you could increase it, but with changing climate, will that happen?
Yeah. So again, and that is an issue. That's what we're concerned about. And how do we keep those values up? And thinking about wheat, for example, we have about 300 different experimental conditions on my website for wheat, the biomass increase, and they average about, it's like 35 to 36%, maybe as high as 38%. I can't quite remember, but it's definitely mid-30s%. And that's an average of all sorts of conditions. And as you rightly note, there are a lot of studies that look at, well, what happens under extreme conditions if we decrease the nitrogen content, if we add hot temperatures, a heat wave here, or water stress. And so all of those studies are actually included in that average, that grand average that I have. So I think it's a fair representative of the future that still, despite, if you do have those conditions, you're still going to see positive increase in yields. And I think that just the data that I showed you from the satellites seem to bear that out, that you're going to, despite all the things that happen in nature, and yeah, you're going to get some places that, it might not be the best place to grow anymore because of a change in climate or regime, but on the balance of the whole, it should be fine. And especially when we start looking at genotypes and finding which are the best genotypes, because, as you know, obviously they respond to other things besides CO2. There's different genotypes that respond better at higher temperatures or lower temperatures or so on and so forth.
I mean, it seems to me what would be really useful to do is to be able to help farmers around the world, around the country, around the world, be able to adapt quickly and put plant the right genotype in each season.
Yes.
So climate science is working hard to try and see if it can make seasonal predictions or something about rain. It's struggling, no question about it. But I guess what you really want to do is have them be able to plant the right kind of crop. And so we get these extreme rains where they can't plant and everything, and then they end up planting a species that doesn't get to maturity by the end of the growing season. And yet you might want to switch to something. So we need more versatile farmers, and they need all the information you're talking about.
Exactly. I totally agree with that irrespective of what's going to happen in the future, we need a better understanding of the different cultivars and what we can grow and what can be utilized. That area of research is far behind. And certainly I'm a supporter of finding out what crops grow best under what conditions, and that should be analyzed in the future.
Yes, I'm Caleb Rosser. I just wanted to add on to Mr. McCracken's comments when you have to look at a broader picture on this remarkable research that you've done. You're familiar with this claims, particularly in a recent Harvard School of Public Health study, that millions will have lower levels of nutrition because under CO2 enhancement, some crops lose some percent of zinc, iron, and protein, so people may be having more crops from your research, but will be, millions will be at risk of getting poor nutrition. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely, sure. And so that's an issue that still is being fleshed out. A lot of those early papers would find those declines by simply looking at all parts of the plant. They might look, instead of the grain, they might look at the stem or the leaf and so forth. And so, but what really matters is the grain, the stuff that people eat, right, or the fruit. And what you find here, I'll just show you a couple of slides. This is a recent one looking at spinach, a vitamin C concentration that increased with elevated CO2 by 14.4%. Here's another one looking at total antioxidant capacity of Chinese cabbage and lettuce in response to CO2 increase. And what's interesting about this graphic here, it takes you out to CO2 concentrations which we're really never going to achieve. But you can see here that these antioxidants were improved all the way out, to 3,000 parts per million. Now, it is true that some plants will show a decline in nutrient, anywhere from 5 to 10%, but others do not. It is not a ubiquitous thing. Now, this next slide I'm going to show you is the results of a meta-analysis that was recently produced last year, 2018, Frontiers in Plant Science. A meta-analysis of 57 published works examining the effects of CO2 enrichment on the nutritional quality of vegetables. And what the authors report here is that overall, elevated CO2 promotes the accumulation of antioxidants in vegetables, thus improving vegetable quality. While adding at the CO2-induced stimulation of total antioxidant capacity, total phenols, total flavonoids, ascorbic acid, and chlorophyll B indicate an improvement of beneficial compounds. Now that said, you can see the graphic over here, all the different minerals and nutrients and so forth that they analyzed. And you can see here's 0 right here. The gray values are ones that really had no statistically significant change either way. And so some are in that gray range. Some are also in the negative range. Several are in the positive range. And so overall, that's why they concluded that there would be a positive effect on nutrition. Here again, more research is probably needed, but there are other ways that you can overcome nutritional deficiency. That is simply by, again, going to a different cultivar adding perhaps some fertilizer at the right time in the growth cycle, et cetera.
But wouldn't you agree that since these changes do not take place for another 50 years of human history, people at that point, their diets will be different, they'll be a lot wealthier, the whole
Good,
situation
good.
looks a lot different.
Sure, and the other thing is, oftentimes it's complained, well, this is going to hurt the people in Africa. Well, not really. If you're producing more food, because actually the total content of the nutrients is almost always increased significantly in these plants. It's the concentration that gets a little bit diluted because they produce so much more biomass. So if you have to take a couple more bites of food from that extra food that was produced to get the same amount of nutrition, hey, that's wonderful if you live in the third world.
I'm Anita Gallagher with Executive Intelligence Review, and I wonder if you could give us a picture of the reception of your findings in the United States government, the agricultural establishment, and other countries to some extent. I mean, I think of Germany, for example, as an extreme contrast to the kind of thing that you're raising, because they're in a kind of environmentalist lockstep right now. Mm-hmm. But maybe if you could give us a picture of the people who are most receptive, nations or groups within nations.
Sure. So a lot of people surprisingly are not aware of these growth enhancing benefits of CO2, and so it's a surprise to them. And I think the countries that focus the most on this, just thinking about every week I go through hundreds of abstracts of papers and report them and include them on our website. But the research that is being done in this area right now is mainly coming from third world countries. China and India drive this. They're the ones that are producing this kind of research more than any other country. It used to be different. The United States back in the 80s and 90s did a lot of CO2 enrichment studies. Not so much anymore, but really the third world is driving the research today.
Do you think there are any negative effects of increased CO2 on either humanity or just the natural environment in general that we should be wary of as we look at the benefits here?
Well, the effects, direct effects, I would say no. Direct effects for the concentrations that we're talking about, no. There potentially could be in the ocean acidification, which was brought up, is an issue, but having said that, that's a very relatively new area of research, and I have a whole set of slides I could show you on that as well. That area is still being ferreted out. The point there is a lot of animals don't show any negative responses, but the ones that do, when you allow enough time for acclimation to take place and transgenerational acclimation to take place, that those negative effects are often removed. And so we still need to get more research in those areas, but for the most part, I think that CO2 will likely cause, or could very well possibly cause, an increase in temperatures across the globe. I think the sensitivity is a lot smaller than what the IPCC or the UN suggests. It suggests a 2.5 to 4.5 or more degrees Celsius increase. I think it's about an order of magnitude lower, the sensitivity. But even if the temperatures do rise, there's a lot of benefits that come from that as well. I could show you a series of slides that demonstrate that human health benefits from warmer temperatures because you have a net savings of lives. Because as temperatures warm, fewer people die at the cold end of the temperature spectrum than at the warm end of the temperature spectrum. So you actually have a net savings of lives. And so there's a lot of benefits that can come from a warming climate too. And thinking about that, that this particular period of history of the Earth, our temperatures are still 1 or 2 degrees Celsius below what they were during most of the last 4 interglacial periods, okay, when we had much less CO2. and life thrived and survived. And so, I doubt there'll be much of a problem from a small 1 to 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature.
On or did? Okay. Paul Gallagher, I'm with Executive Intelligence Review also. I wanted to bring up another question because it seems to me a number of the questions directed to you, and particularly, I don't know if it's Dr. McCracken or Mr. McCracken, have essentially said that despite what you presented was global data, they don't believe it because maybe crop yields are going down in Ukraine because when in fact the Russian-Ukraine combined grain production is going up. And I remember already in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s, the World Watch, Lester Brown's World Watch, was claiming that world food production was declining at that time. And it seems to me that was just as much propaganda as claiming that it's declining at this time. But I want to raise another question, which is that since you obviously have a great deal of scientific data here to contest the question, the president has been reported considering forming a presidential climate research panel in order to re-study these questions which have been claimed to be settled by, I guess you would say the media, have been claimed to be settled, but which you clearly have a great deal of data which shows they're not at all settled. Do you think that's a step that should be taken? Should we have that kind of blue ribbon panel on a national basis in order to re-examine this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe would be helpful. Science, everyone should welcome debate, right, on science. And if you feel so strongly that your side is correct, then yeah, you should absolutely welcome debate. And it certainly won't hurt anything to have that opportunity to take place. So, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it as simply as that absolutely I feel that we should be reevaluated. And that's how science works. We have hypotheses, we test them, we reevaluate them, and go through that process over and over and over again. I guess that's about it. Last one. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rosalind Brummett. I work for the Senate Agriculture Committee. So you mentioned an overall greening of the planet and the increased benefits that plants see under increased CO2 levels. Can you speak to anything in regards to the impact that we're seeing with increased algal blooms? And water quality? A lot of our, small towns and, farm production areas are seeing and being affected directly by this.
Yeah, so I did allude to that, if you recall in my presentation, how, you get those, if you have excessive nutrients applied in farms, that those excessive nutrients can run off and down into water bodies and cause those harmful algal blooms. And so that's not quite my foray, that particular issue. But it would seem to be that if there were ways to keep that from running off, perhaps using less nutrients, you can over-apply nutrients, obviously. And so a lot of that might be just educating farmers on the right amounts to use. And then, maybe providing means to stop some of that runoff as it comes so it won't quite make it down into some of those water bodies. I think that might be helpful as well.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to Dr. Idso for his research and for his presentation here today. I couldn't help thinking as I heard the discussion about the benefits that will be there in 50 years when CO2 rises from 400 parts per million to 600 million, that it's unfortunate we won't be around to enjoy them because we have only 12 years to live. Have a lovely day.